got a lot going on here. Hey everyone, thanks for coming out for this year's CCCP lecture with Hamza Walker. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Mark Wasuda. I co-direct CCCP, the Critical Curatorial Conceptual Practices and Architecture program with Felicity Scott. There's no way to do this without being personal. I know Hamza, I've known him for a while now. I've worked with him, he's a friend, he's a collaborator. And anticipating this talk tonight, I realized that how I know Hamza has prompted me to see the world in which we work with a new clarity. I mean this in many ways, but first I mean that we most often work through relationships. And in most cases, if we're lucky, these are good, rich, enjoyable, productive relationships. We're happy, we know our collaborators well, and sometimes we know them maybe just well enough. Hamza is the rare other category. Even for those we may know extremely well, it isn't enough. We want to and should learn much more about what they are thinking, what they are doing now and next. This is the first reason we've invited Hamza here, so we can all learn more about what he is doing and thinking now. And this is not because I don't know Hamza. Visiting Hamza usually means that you find him in his office at LAX Art. There's incredible new work on the wall. There are diagrams of projects to come. There are calendars the size of murals. There are towering stacks of books. There are interesting people hanging around, or people that you suspect might be famous. And Hamza is talking. He's talking about what he's doing with them. He's talking about their work. He's talking about the gallery. He's talking about the art world. He's talking about funding. He's talking about institutions. He's talking about LA and the USA. He's talking about places beyond America. This should be a school. This is what I think every time I visit Hamza. I think this man should be running a school. It is an envy-producing machine. It is impossible to not think, I want to be part of what is happening here. In a different space, this might look like chaos. Keeping an institution like LAX Art going is Sisyphean. It is a perpetual labor of many kinds. But Hamza has the kind of deftness that makes something extremely hard look easy. It is a magic act. So in my mind, it was never a question of whether we would ask Hamza to give one of our yearly lectures. It was always a question of when and around what project. A couple of years ago, Felicity, Leah Meisterlin, and I were having dinner with Hamza, freezing outside in a shed in Brooklyn when Hamza first told us about the Monuments exhibition. It was obvious that this was the project that he should speak about. We are thrilled it worked out and that he is with us here tonight. You can read his bio online, but just a few salient points. He was co-curator of Made in LA 2016, only at the Hammer Museum. He was a juror at the Venice Biennale's Golden Lion Award in 2019. He's on many boards. He does lots of writing, essays, commentaries, and journals, catalogs, monographs. He has won a bunch of awards, the Norton Curatorial Grant, the Walter Hopps Award for Curatorial Achievement, et cetera, et cetera. He is director of LAX Art in Los Angeles, a space of curatorial, artistic, architectural, exhibition, production, and experimentation. To list just a few projects, in 2022, Josh Klein Adaptation, 2021, The Absolute Right to Exclude, Reflections on and Implications of Cheryl Harris' Whiteness as Property, Barbara Stofak-Solomon, Relax into the Invisible. And before moving to LAX Art, Hamza was Associate Curator and Director of Education at the Renaissance Society in Chicago from 1994 to 2016, where he produced a massive amount of work and exhibitions, including 2014 Teen Paranormal Romance, 2013 Suicide Narcissist, 2009 Several Silences, 2008 Black Is, Black Ain't, and in 1997 with Kara Walker, Hamza's collaborator on the Monuments exhibition, presenting Negro scenes drawn upon my passage through the South and reconfigured for the benefit of enlightened audiences, wherever such may be found, by myself, Mrs. K.E.B. Walker, colored. For this exhibition, Hamza wrote with his usual force and humor the following. To put it bluntly, as the legibility of her imagery warrants, Walker's installations are a freak scene a la Dassad. They are a psychosexual mess of Looney Tunes proportion. Needless to say, it is the 200-year history of a shameful act conducted squarely within our consciousness that makes it possible for Walker to not only refuse shame, but to blur the distinction between forms of shame. Shame, refusing shame, and recognizing the pervasive shamefulness of the history that brought the Confederate monuments into existence and kept them in view, but for many, unseen for what they are, I imagine is linked to what Hamza will speak about tonight, and possibly as well how the Monuments Project turns around the nexus of vision, exposure, the shame of our history, and the ongoing shame of our time. Please welcome Hamza Walker.
That is the warmest introduction I've ever received, I have to say, Mark. And it really is quite beautiful to be here amongst colleagues whose work I greatly admire, as you do know. You, as curators, really set a bar that I strive for, having worked with you on 2 outstanding projects. So I have a lot of slides, so fasten your seatbelts. See how many we get through. Stop me before I kill again. So, introduction. Monuments, co-organized by Museum of Contemporary Art Los Angeles and LAX Art, slated for the fall of 2025. Which way is the clicker working? Am I pointing it at the right thing? Let's see. It's, turn it off, turn it back on. Okay, maybe I shouldn't have done that. Oh no, it was fine. Yeah, it was moving. We were fine. Ah, okay, got it. All right, there we go. Oh, was that the problem? Okay, got it. All right. So here's the curatorial team. Myself, Bennett Simpson, who's the inside man at Museum of Contemporary Art Los Angeles, and Kara, who was gracious enough to hear my plea. So what is the show? It's a very simple conceit. It's an exhibition of decommissioned monuments, the core of which are Confederate monuments, shown alongside works of contemporary art. And the works of contemporary art are both pre-existing work and commissions of new work. Right. All right, so these are 11 of the 16 featured monuments that will be showing the exhibition. So the one that's the fiery furnace is actually the melting down of the Robert E. Lee that was in Charlottesville. And that's the Jefferson School of African American Heritage actually took possession of that monument. They're melting it down. They're going to take the bronze, give it to an artist to make a new work to be unveiled in 2027, which is the 10-year anniversary of the Unite the Right rally. But in the meantime, they've already melted it down. So yeah, this is our little rogues gallery, as I like to call it. We'll see some more of that. So the exhibition will take place at the Geffen, or the lion's share of it. It will be an exhibition in 2 places, both at MoCA Geffen and one standalone project at LAX Art. But the Geffen, for those of you who don't know, it's a 40,000 square foot warehouse space in downtown Los Angeles. So structurally, it can actually take the weight, size of the monuments. All right, so the monuments, this is where they'll be coming from the cities, municipalities that are loaning the pieces. And this is all just so you can get an overview. All right, so just to zoom out to 30,000 feet, right, there are over 800 Confederate monuments littering the landscape, and only 200 of those have come down. Now, I would make the argument that which 200 is quite important, right? So having New Orleans and Richmond come down, that's kind of like, go for the heart, right? Pull it out. And render the rest of them zombies. A lot of them are simply cookie cutter monuments, Soldier at the Ready, Soldier at Rest. But the ones in New Orleans and Richmond were major, major works. I mean, very, very large. So in terms of their dismantling, seeing those bases, the statues are one thing, that's fine actually in some sense, the bronze. It's the dismantling of the bases that takes a lot of resources. And when you see that, you realize those things work forever. So of the 200 that came down, there were about 70 that were of interest for one reason or another. Artistically, it could do with the personage. And then, so we sent out inquiries to the stewards of the objects and heard back from about 30, 40, and then had 15, 16 lenders to the exhibition who responded positively. All right. So if I had to sum up one of the key points of the exhibition, it's about dismantling the lost cause. The lost cause is an inaccurate historical narrative that portrays the South as a noble victim fighting for ideals that somehow transcend, right, slavery, which is the true cause of the Civil War, right? So the arguments about states' rights, right? Well, the question is a state's right to do what? That's the question, right? 1835, the nullification crisis, that was the first threat of secession, right? Led by South Carolina, right? And a number of states signed on with John C. Calhoun, right, who wanted to read the Constitution and treat it a la carte. And they said, yeah, John, we're with you on this one. Georgia, Virginia, they were like, go tell the federal government, no more tariffs on the South. And then slowly, one by one, when it came down to it, they were like, nah, we can't do this. When the federal government said, look, we are sending the tax man in with you will give us our money at gunpoint. And so when it came to tariffs, the states weren't willing to secede. When it came to slavery, they were all in. So just to give you, a little tidbit about American history and why slavery is the cause of the Civil War, right? Full stop. But the lost cause is the source of our continued equivocating about it, right? All the way up to Nikki Haley, right? This is why the purchase that it has on our imaginations can't be overstated, right? So the idea that we're ready to take these statues down really represents ripping out the wiring that is the lost cause, right? It's in textbooks. I got that stuff when I was in high school, right? The issue about states' rights. Now, what that really suggests is how long is Reconstruction, right? Formally, Reconstruction goes from 1865 to 1876. 77, the troops are pulled out of the South, right? But in terms of these statues having, an afterlife of sorts, it suggests that Reconstruction, in fact, didn't end, but is still going on, right? We're still living through history. I think that that's an important point of the exhibition, right? So here are two examples, right? We're still arguing over the cause of the Civil War, right? And I have to say, hearing Nikki Haley, when she then decided to up the ante on, what did she say? The country has never been racist. It's individuals at all. And it's just like, oh my God, I didn't realize that I understood, Holocaust denial, right? But when hearing that, I just felt like, it's like, oh my God, this is a total affront. It's as if it's like slavery never existed as a formal structure. It's like, no, what are you saying? So here we are. So here's the background for the exhibition. Mother Emanuel Church, Charleston, South Carolina. This is a pillar of Black theology. I mean, historically, the Mother Emanuel Church is one of two churches where the African Methodist Episcopal Church was founded. So one is in Charleston, South Carolina. The other branch was in Philadelphia. This was founded by Denmark Vesey, right, who said led what would have been one of the biggest slave revolts in the country. And it was also the site where 2015, the Mother Emanuel Church massacre conducted by Dylann Roof, right? He's a neo-Confederate white supremacist. He's not from South Carolina. He specifically chose Mother Emanuel Church because he knew its significance, right? So this act was within a history of terrorizing of black churches, right? So here the Mother Emanuel 9, right? And the one that is still in living memory is the 16th Street Church in Birmingham, Alabama, right? Which was one of the catalysts of, you know, a big turning point in the civil rights movement. That's where the 4 girls were killed, right? So the echoes when the Dylann Roof went into the church and killed the 9 congregants, it had echoes of this event, right? Right. So 10 days after that event, that's when Bree Newsom climbed up the flagpole. That was the first call for Confederate signs and symbols to be removed, right? So the first mayor to heed that call was Mitch Landrieu of New Orleans. Took him 2 years to get legislation through New Orleans City Council. New Orleans was the first to fall, right? At the same time, Charlottesville was concurrent right after New Orleans. So when New Orleans in 2017, the statues had been removed, but as early as 2016, the Charlottesville City Council had passed legislation to remove the Robert E. Lee and the Stonewall Jackson statues. But what happened after New Orleans was that gave the time, when they saw what went down in New Orleans, that gave time for the extremist element to organize the Unite the Right rally, right, of 2017, August of 2017, right? So that produced a counter protest, right? So mayors around the country decided to take down statues in the wake of Charlottesville, both as a public safety hazard, basically. Either protesters were going to yank them down or neo-Confederates were going to come and rally around them. So that prompted the mayors to basically take matters into their own hands. City halls just said, okay, let's take them down. So 40 statues had come down, and that's around the time that we had the idea for the exhibition. And so we were looking, you know, again, the universe of just 40 monuments. It wasn't until 2020, right, with the murder of George Floyd, that an additional 150 statues came down, right, by the end of 2020, right? So 2020 to the present, well, now we're up to 200 coming down. And that was, in terms of the chain of events, the monuments issue was following its own track, and the Black Lives Matter movement was on a separate track, in a way. I mean, if you think back to 2016 even, and those high-profile police shootings of black subjects, black victims, Colin Kaepernick taking a knee, that was 2016, right? That had its own kind of trajectory. And it was the murder of George Floyd where those two things merged together. Everything is everything. So this is what we're borrowing, and again, where it's coming from. Right here, the towns again. Baltimore is loaning us 4. Right, this double equestrian, Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee, and Soldiers and Sailors by Frederick Ruxtell on the right. And we'll show the monuments many of the monuments that we'll show are damaged. They've been either paint bombed or damaged beyond repair in terms of attempts to yank them down. And so the exhibition isn't simply, it's not a question of just like putting the monuments back up in the condition or state that they're in, right? When you see these monuments that have been damaged, they aren't read as historical artifacts as much as they are read in relationship to 2020, right? 2017. So these are the other two coming from Baltimore. Rajatani, who was not a Confederate, he was actually the Supreme Court justice responsible for the Dred Scott decision, right, which is kind of the precondition for the Civil War, right? And like I said, it's decommissioned monuments, the core of which are Confederate monuments. So there are several that aren't Confederate monuments, and we've taken to calling the show Confederates and Friends. So, and on the right is a memorial to the women of the Confederacy. And what's interesting about this is the use, and I'll return to this, the use of the Pietà, right, in that, right, which, and if you extend the allegory, right, Christ will rise again, as will the South. Right, so here are the four after they were removed to an undisclosed location in Baltimore, right? And it was interesting to go and see these things, right? The cities took them down, and they were usually, and really, it was so funny, the pattern, on the edge of town where they keep all the snow plows and salt trucks and stuff, right? So, you know, and you go there, and it's like, you know, just this whole city workers just hanging out, doing what they do and stuff, and there are these things, right? So I added a lot of slides tonight. One group around this particular monument to tell its story. This is the Battle of Liberty Place, coming from New Orleans, and it is the only monument to have had inscribed on it that it is in fact a monument to white supremacy, right? The Battle of Liberty Place was 1870, the Battle of Liberty Place is 1874, yeah, 1874. A group called the White League actually overthrew the Louisiana government, which was at the time was the Reconstruction era government, and the Fed stepped in and said, no, 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 you put that government back in place. And then 2 years later, at the end of Reconstruction, that government was actually voted out of office. The White League felt vindicated, and so they wanted to erect a monument commemorating the Battle of Liberty Place. And so the text around the bottom tells the story, right? And so troops took over the state government and reinstated the usurpers above that, right? But the election of 1876 recognized white supremacy in the South and gave us our state. That text was actually added in 1932, which is the 30s were when the Klan had the greatest hold and purchase on American political life, right? This photograph was actually taken, the one on the left was actually taken by Dorothea Lange when she was doing her FSA work in the South. So this would have been new, which I love about Dorothy. Just like, what have we here, right? It's like, click, you know, somebody had a camera. So this is a very storied monument, right? The Battle of Liberty Place, right? So it's been protested throughout. It's been taken down, put back up, taken down, put back up for a number of reasons. But throughout its life, because of this text, not just because of the text that's on it, it's been, especially throughout the 1960s and 1970s, vigorously protested. So after the first attempt at recontextualization was a plaque in the 70s saying that this no longer represents the views of modern day New Orleanians, right? Later, the text was removed, and then they placed this placard on, right? In honor of those Americans on both sides of the conflict, right? Who died in the battle. Both sides. Find people on both sides, right? So here it is, right? What is it? Let this something, conflict serves a lesson for the future. Right, we know where that's headed. So here it is. It got further shattered when it was finally removed, permanently removed. Right. So now these are images of the protests, right, that I wanted to include. Right. This is the some portion or subcommittee of the NAACP Youth Council protesting at 74. Right. This monument supports white supremacy. Take it down. 1978, Kalamu Ya Salam, spokesman for the Committee for Accountable Police, right, is leading the calls for its removal. And this is a counter protest that was held on the same, earlier that day, there was a Ku Klux Klan rally on the site, right? So here's another photograph of that. That's 1978, right? 1985, Hitler's birthday. Sidewalk march, potluck picnic, meet me at the monument, right? So this was, this piece of ephemera was hauled in as evidence when there was a call for it to be removed in 1985, right? And I like the fact that it was billed as a nuisance. Just a nuisance. Such a bother when those neo-Nazis come and traffic just gets bad. 1993, right? The first time I saw this photograph, I thought it was a Jeff Wall photo, and that these guys are like out of the Matrix or some shit, right? Avery Alexander in a chokehold, right? Protesting the monument. Now this is David Dukes, who was rallying there, right? You remember David Duke, right? 2004, paint bombed, right? So, there it is in plain sight. It's at the service of, right? So here it is finally taken down and dismantled, which is how we'll show it, right? In its dismantled state. And we've invited Monument Lab to actually make a documentary, a film chronicling the history of this monument. Boston, Massachusetts, the Emancipation Group. There's a version of this in DC. This version came down in Boston. It was removed because of the depiction of the black figure, Archer Alexander. Frederick Douglass was at the unveiling, spoke at the unveiling of the statue, the DC version of it. And he afterwards let his sentiments, his true sentiments, be known about how much he didn't like the statue, right? The idea of, freedom as being bestowed as if it weren't fought for, right? Freedom as yours to give, right? White savior complex. Archer Alexander, turns out, has an amazing life story. He was a spy for the Union Army, had to wait out the last few months of the war. He actually made attempts at self-emancipation. He could get himself out of slavery, but he couldn't get his wife and children out of slavery. Worked in brickyards in St. Louis. And the craziest genetic lotto, he is the great-great-grandfather of Muhammad Ali, which I just can't believe. Just a plaque with that alone is enough. Right. So this is Stephen Foster, who's considered the father of American popular music. His string of hits include Oh Susanna, Camptown Races, My Old Kentucky Home. From Pittsburgh, he also wrote scores for what was a burgeoning comedy routine called minstrelsy. And here he's seen pinning one of his, Old Black Joe, another one of his hits, Uncle Ned, right, which is unsparing in its use of the N-word. And this was taken down, and I suspect it wouldn't have been taken down were it not for the Uncle Remus figure, right, at his feet. That's his muse, Uncle Ned. Right. It's coming from Houston. This is the spirit of the Confederacy. And that's John Guess, who's the director of the African American Museum in Houston. So in 3 instances, African American institutions have actually taken possession of these monuments. So when we talk about recontextualization, right, I would say perhaps the most the best way, not best way, I don't know if I care it is the best way, but instead of any kind of plaques, like where do you put these things, right? What does it mean if they're suddenly in an state historical museum versus where they once were? But stewardship, right? Who owns it? Who has possession of this thing, right? Is another, a major shift in context. That's what I'm trying to say. Right? The most effective form of recontextualization, right? And when John Guest was offered a statue in Houston, he said, no, I don't want a named figure. I don't want a general. I want the spirit. That's my allegory. And I showed this. Glenn Ligon is on our board, and when I was showing Glenn, talking about the show, I showed this. I can see Glenn, and if you know Glenn, it was on Zoom, and he got really close to the camera, right? And Glenn is like, his glasses on. And I said, yeah, Glenn, I think this is the gay Confederate monument. And he was like, I didn't want to say anything. I did not. I was like, I knew what you were thinking, Glenn. What's with that palm frond? So this is Josephus Daniels. This is coming from the Daniels family. And Josephus Daniels he started the biggest newspaper in North Carolina, out of Raleigh-Durham. And he was an avowed white supremacist, anti-Negro rule, to use the quote, very much against blacks getting the right to vote. But he used his newspaper to drum up sentiments resulting in the Wilmington Massacre of 1898. And the Wilmington Massacre is very similar to the Battle of Liberty Place, right? Where the North Carolina government was overthrown by an angry mob of 2,000 white men, right? And it was overthrown under Reconstruction. Politicians had to court the black vote. So the Republican Party was courting the black vote, and they had what were called fusion tickets, where you would have a white governor and a black lieutenant governor, which was the case in North Carolina. So the Wilmington Massacre is the only successful coup on American soil, where a duly elected government was completely thrown out of office, right? And so Josephus Daniels, a complicated figure also, and it's quite beautiful, I think, that the family is lending this piece. He's going to go back, when he returns, he'll be in a cemetery, not on a pedestal, as Frank Daniels said. But he was a kind of Southern Democrat, right, paradigmatically so. He, at the same time, was very much against blacks having the right to vote. He was in favor of women's suffrage, right? You'll see. So what constitutes a monument? Jefferson Davis was the president of the Confederacy. This is Montgomery, Alabama, right? So to think of, right, Jefferson Davis and Rosa Parks Avenue will meet, right? It's fate, right? This is the same landscape in which the Civil War was fought, right? And then the next layer on top of it is the Civil Rights Movement. So here you have it, right? So they decommissioned Jefferson Davis Avenue, and it is now Fred Gray Avenue. That's Jefferson Davis's, that's Rosa Parks' attorney, not Jefferson Davis's attorney. Fred Gray, who's like 94, is still alive and kicking and still at it, still a rabble-rouser. Duchy, insofar as this black man can have a favorite Confederate monument, it is this one for me. Duchy, the first decommissioned Confederate monument. This is Elberton, Georgia. We're borrowing it from the Elberton Granite Association, and I really like this thing. It's kind of good old boys, fellas. And it's great that they totally understood the exhibition and really agreed with the idea about dialogue around these things. Duchy, Arthur Beeter, who did the statue, was a German immigrant. You can see it's kind of this like romantic, medieval, I have another slide of Dutchy now. Archaic, right? The town hated it when it was unveiled. Ran Arthur Beeter out of town, never to be heard from again. 4 years later, a group of Confederate veterans, angry at Dutchy's semblance to a Union soldier, yank him down off the pedestal. He breaks and disappears. And someone figured out that these Confederate veterans would have been kind of old and couldn't carry these slabs of granite. Where did he go? They did tests, found out that he was buried next to the pedestal where he once was. So they excavated him in 1986, ran him through a car wash. And now he sits in the Elberton Granite Association Museum. And now, my favorite thing about Dutchy is that he was pulled down by angry Confederate soldiers, right? So there are angry people on both sides. That is the lesson Dutchy has to tell us, right? This is Richmond, and we've got a few coming from Richmond. This is the Jefferson Davis Memorial. So we'll get the allegorical figure at the top, which is a female, an allegory for vindication. Deo Vindice is the text that's actually on the base where she was standing. And then we'll also have the Jefferson Davis statue, right? And Jefferson Davis was yanked down and damaged. His head got caved in and the arm is coming apart, totally paint spattered. And when this is in the possession of this is on view at the Valentine Museum as an artifact of the protests in Richmond. And Richmond is really important. Richmond, unlike other cities where either City Hall just suddenly said, okay, we're gonna do this stuff martial law style, take down these monuments. In Richmond, the protest came from the ground up, right? It was people protesting that got them removed, that got Monument Avenue dismantled. And when this was, so they wanted, the Valentine Museum took this as an artifact of that period of protest. And Bill Martin, the director of the museum, told me the story about when they took it in for conservation. And he said, the conservators said, we think there's a lot of uric acid spattered on this. And Bill said, are you telling me what I think you're telling me? And he said, yes. And he said, I want you to keep every molecule of it and seal it up. I want it all on there as a matter of record. Matthew Fontaine Maury, this is the biggest of the monuments that we're borrowing. So we'll get the figure of Matthew Fontaine Maury and the allegorical globe component. He was the admiral of the Confederate Navy. And here he's depicted, right, as a man of science. He's also considered the father, show of lots of fathers, of modern day oceanography. So the tide and current studies that he conducted are still for shipping, to make more efficient shipping lanes along the eastern seaboard. Those are still in effect, and he also did a lot of work with atmospheric sciences, right? And there it is. Right, the seas as a source of peril, immigration. And the stone from Richmond, Virginia. So this is the basis, and this is, I think, an important element of the exhibition, right? Because the second you start to have stone fragments, I think it pushes, it does something temporally, right? Like these things suddenly become archaeological, right? And so I think in terms of the stone and then looking at the statues, it's like, what civilization did this? It's like ours. So this particular view is of the stone just from the Robert E. Lee base. So this is the graveyard in Richmond. They're at the water treatment plant, also on the edge of town. So this is about a football field. It's about 100 yards, and about 3/5 of that is just the Lee base. So here's some of the fragments. Hashtag days without an extrajudicial execution of a U.S. citizen by police. Right. So we'll also borrow this granite slab from the base of the Charlottesville Robert E. Lee. Right. So I mentioned the melting down of the Robert E. Lee from Charlottesville. We're going to borrow from the Jefferson School the ingots. So after it's been melted down, so we'll have that Robert E. Lee statue in substance but not form. So here are the commissioned artists. So there are 20 artists, and I think 13 commissions. Oh, sad to say, William Popel, forgot to remove him from the slide. It's a real loss. And so here are just a couple of the commissions. Kevin Jerome Everson, filmmaker, teaches at UVA. Bree Newsom was not the first to climb up the flagpole to remove the Confederate flag. 1984, Richard Bradley in San Francisco, of all places, went up the flagpole. It was a show of flags, League of Nations, one of which, Confederate flag, in San Francisco, of all places, they included the Confederate flag in the show of the League of Nations. Dianne Feinstein was the mayor at the time. Richard Bradley, dressed as a Union soldier, climbs up the flagpole, which is a total William Popel-like performance. Climbs up the flagpole not once, but 3 times and tears down the Confederate flag. And it's done under the auspices of Spartacus Youth. I don't know if anybody remembers Spartacus Youth. They were active on the campus when I went to college. Yeah, the neo-Marxist group. Always handing out flyers along with Jews for Jesus. So, yeah. But I love this, down with the Confederate flag of slavery, of what finished the Civil War toward a worker state. Right. So Memorial Day, this is Bethany Collins. The first Memorial Day, it turns out 1865, was actually organized by a group of women going by the name of the Patriot Association, of black women who wanted to honor soldiers, Union soldiers, that were in a prisoner of war camp in Charleston. And this prisoner of war camp was on what was a former race course. And they died, a lot of them, of disease, exposure. And so there was a large unmarked grave. Right after the Civil War, they wanted to reinter the bodies and give them a dignified burial, recognizing their sacrifices for their freedom. And so it was a very big parade event. Kids scattered the field with rose petals, which are the state flower. And that first Memorial Day tidbit was lost to history. And it was only recently found, a newspaper article was the only thing mentioning this event. And so it's not Memorial Day in terms of a repeating holiday, right? Other towns, a few towns laying claim to the first Memorial Day in that regard. But this was the first Memorial Day immediately in the wake of the Civil War. Right? And so Bethany Collins is working with, we got the granite from one of the bases of the Confederate monument, and she's working with a stone carver and this is in progress, to make flower petals out of the granite, so to repurpose the granite to make hundreds and hundreds of flower petals, which will be scattered on the floor. So in effect, she's memorializing the first memorializers. Right? It's Matthew Fontaine Murray. And we've asked Walter Price, and this is the first time I've shown these publicly. This is what you get when you wait that extra year, Mark. The show just marinates and gets better. So this is Walter Price, young painter here. He's having a big retrospective at the Walker this summer, but he did a beautiful series, about 15 paintings. He was in the Navy, and so when I approached Walter about being in the show, he said, "Oh, Matthew Fontaine Murray is mine." And instead of focusing on Matthew Fontaine Murray, he got obsessed actually with the fact that when Matthew Fontaine Murray was in the Navy, he was injured, and the injury to his leg kind of took him out of action, and that's when he became a man of science, right? And These paintings are about 6 feet, 7 feet high, some of them, and 12, 13 feet long. And Walter just walked back and forth. He put the canvas down and then just marched back and forth, recalling his days in the Navy and learning how to march in unison and marching as central to protests, the marches. And so I think of these paintings as like, you know, an Alma Thomas, Bruce Nauman love child, right? Kind of performative, quite beautiful, right? So here's some of the existing works of the artists. Leonardo drew, this piece is raw cotton. It's about 10 feet high, 15 feet long, somewhere in there, 500 pounds of cotton, right? Abstraction, these figurative statues, right? So black artists using the language of minimalism, right, to some extent. So this large rectilinear slab, but how abstract can it be, right? So Torquato Dyson, right, the irregular geometric forms, recalling John McCracken, engendering the rhetoric of Afrofuturism, right? So these kinds of juxtapositions, right? You can just throw a neoclassical bronze in there and, you know, watch the sparks fly. It's like the best kind of curating. Don't have to do shit. Just bring the horses to the gate. Nona Faustine, the White Shoes series. And that is the artist. She photographed herself either completely nude or bare-chested at sites around, in and around New York City. And the sites are former plantations, slave burial grounds, auction sites. So here she is down in the financial district. I believe this is a burial ground. Right, again in the financial district. And I love this one with the murals on the left and to the right. And they use the show as an occasion to bring together Andre Serrano's Clan series from 1990, right? And this is work that, you know, if you crying about Philip Gus's shit, like, it's like this, you know, Serrano, peak of powers, right? And he told me an amazing anecdote about going down and doing these photographs. He said, no, they were wholly aware of who I was. And when I went down to take these photographs of the upper echelon of the Ku Klux Klan, the head of the Ku Klux Klan said to his secretary, hold all my calls. I'm having my portrait taken by the infamous, the notorious Andre Serrano. And he was just like, couldn't believe it. It was just game recognized game. I mean, they knew that I had done Piss Christ, and they were just like, nah, we don't want, you know, we don't want Andy Leibovitz. No, we want the motherfucker that did Piss Christ. That's like, we want his notoriety. And that's like, not bad. And so I've always thought these pieces were amazing. And they're in museum collections, and they cannot go up on the walls these days. So I figure, let's bring that beat back. The culture wars of yore. Martin Puryear, Tabernacle, right? Martin weighing in on making a link between, you know, present day grievances, historical injustices. This is based on the kepi, the cap worn by soldiers at the time of the Civil War. And then he's, you know, those are the crosshairs, making reference to Trayvon Martin, in addition to other high-profile shootings. And it's interesting to have Martin weigh in on that issue in his own sweet way, right? But I just like the link between those two things, right? But still using his formalist language. Josephus Daniels again, and now alongside Josephus Daniels. These are photographs by Hugh Mangum. Hugh Mangum, and that's him in the upper left. Hugh Mangum was had a penny portrait studio from 1897 to 1922 when he died in Raleigh, Durham. And he documented the citizens of Raleigh, Durham on the eve of the Wilmington Massacre, right? And then sometime afterwards. But what you can see is that there was a healthy black middle class there, right? And I know these photographs like individually, but I've never seen them as like a demographic, right? So this is one generation out of the Civil War, right? Who are coming in, have their portraits taken. And what's interesting too is how he did it. It was just like, no, you, just come on in, right? It wasn't like, no, black people come in on Friday. That's when I do those portraits, right? It was just like, all right, right? So his contact sheets were lost. Well, they weren't lost. They were in a barn on the family property where they went untouched for 50 years. So it wasn't until 1974 they said, hey, wait, what are these glass negatives doing here? Contact sheets. So they're in the possession of Duke, right? In their archives. So we'll show, and there are hundreds of these contact sheets. So we'll have prints made and show them, right? And just seeing these also recalls, again, just like the Wilmington Massacre, right? When you see as a class portrait, to think about Tulsa as well, right? And I consider him contemporary insofar as the work was completely not seen until 4 years ago. Right, I love these. Right, and in some of the photographs, it's just, when there's a direct stare, it feels like, wow, the power of photography, right? Across time, somehow, these images. Hank Willis Thomas, this is called Suspension of Hostilities. He's like, my dad was a pretty laid back guy. I could watch anything on TV. He even let me watch Happy Days. He hated Happy Days. He's like, they're fucking trying to totally disavow the 1960s. They want to go back to like 1950s Milwaukee, right, as a golden era. He even let me watch Happy Days. Dukes of Hazzard was a no-go. That's where he called it quits. Like, no Dukes of Hazzard. So this was the forbidden, right? The General Lee. So this is a way of getting the stars and bars in the exhibition, right? To talk about its ubiquity within popular culture. And this is the last, besides, this is John Henry. And this is a series called Stranger Fruit. And he asked mothers and sons to adopt the pose of the Pietà, black mothers and sons. And so, okay. Right, it took a minute. I love this one. Chicago, right, where the L tracks become a cathedral. And I love the fact that it's like the suns are huge. But that's still my boy. Incredible. Right, with this one, right, 1940. It's like, wait, is that a date? No. Right. So yeah, so that's, you can stop there. I don't know how I did on time in terms of images. So yeah, can talk. So the project thus far.
Hamza.
Oh, yeah.
Normally I'd be here with Felicity and it would be much easier, so I'm going to channel her intelligence as I'm thinking about this. I honestly don't even know where to begin with it. It's an extraordinary project, and it's so complicated, and it's so impactful, and it's so difficult. And so I'm going to start just like with some of that technical questions, because it's so I'm interested when you say the sparks are going to fly. And there's something about what is going to make the sparks fly. And of course we get a picture of that. Of course we understand everything, all of the curatorial intelligence that has gone into the project. But part of the way the sparks are going to fly will be because of how we understand what these monuments are and what they have represented and how they have constructed histories like the Lost Cause. And so the sparks are going to fly in a sense because the show will challenge that history, and it will challenge whatever those monuments once signified in the context in which they still continue to signify, I'm sure. Like, I'm sure they're understood to be still kind of potent signifiers, maybe even martyrs, because they've been removed and understood. And so just a question about how you do that. How do the monuments appear within the exhibition? Are they going to be shown dismantled as you've done here? Are they, do they show the traces of the techniques of their dismantling? Because you've spoken about the kind of municipal administrative technique of removal versus the bottom-up activist forms of removal, which might be slightly more violent.
Right.
And so do we understand in the exhibition then a kind of spectrum of techniques of dismantling?
Oh yeah, certainly. I mean, there'll be, you know, the Jefferson Davis can't stand upright, right? I mean, it is what it is. I mean, it's, I'd say, self-evidentiary, right? It's, in other cases, they are in, you know, working order as objects. You know, they're fine. But so to answer that, yes, we want all of it, all of those kinds of narratives, right? So the chunks of stone, just as an anecdote, going to the graveyard with someone who was high up in the Department of Public Works and oversaw the cataloging and registering of the dismantling. But she was a consummate politician, bureaucrat politician. And spreadsheet, she said, okay, the green areas are the Lee, the orange areas are the Jefferson Davis. And I said, oh, okay. So the you know, as they're laid out in this field, they have an order. She said, oh yeah, definitely. And then I noticed they'd all been tagged, right, with, like, you know, a high pressure nail gun and a metal tag and a number on each one of those fragments. I said, wow. So you have them, they're all in order. And then she said, well, that's if they are ever to be reassembled. And that's, you know, and the thought, which is like that was not communicated to the man with the jackhammer. Because it's like, okay, this is how this one's coming down. You know? And so the idea of those things ever being reassembled would be like a Frankenstein of immense proportion, right? So, but it had nothing to do with the actual reality of them ever being reassembled as much as an ability to placate anyone who asks, right? So, like, no, they've all been handled with care and labeled, you know, in their appropriate parts. So just purely, and I just thought that was amazing as just for political purposes, right? That they can't go back up, but we still have to go through the motions of doing all of this, cataloging them, right? These fragments and stuff. So just those kinds of stories. And actually, that story probably won't make it into the show. But there you have it.
Now I'm stuck on this idea of the tags and the administrative procedures and the spreadsheets that have organized the dismantling and it's not really disposal, I'm not sure what it is. It's the removal to the outskirts of town and
Oh yeah, there's no appetite. There is what the afterlives of these objects will be, it's to be determined, right? So everybody wants to know, like, what do we do with them now? Mm-hmm. So, and there's no singular one-size-fits-all solution, right? So Charlottesville is the only place that had an appetite because of what happened in Charlottesville, where the city council felt it had a mandate. They were like, no, you are not taking that shit down and putting it in a crate and then putting it in City Hall or wherever basement. That's not gonna happen. We want that shit out of here. It's just toxic. So that's how the Jefferson School of African American Heritage took possession of one. We actually took possession of the other one because they put out a request for proposals for organizations that were interested in their transformation, right? Now, 14 organizations applied to take possession of them, but they clearly did not read the fine print about transformation. It was just like, and they said explicitly, we do not want these things put back up for further veneration, right? So you had home museums applying, battlefields applying, saying, oh yeah, 20 acres right here, we'll have a full didactic station for it. Everything. They're like, no, that's not what we want done with this. You aren't listening to us. And we're like, oh yeah, we've got some transformation ideas for you. So it turns out, we were able to give the Stonewall Jackson to Carol Walker. So she's done a new commission on an actual Confederate monument. And it was great because the acting was an acting commissioner. And even though she didn't have a vote or say in terms of whose proposal was accepted, she said, I'm the biggest Carol Walker fangirl. It's just like, oh, this is great. That means the gate, when we go to pick this thing up, like the gate will be open. The workers will be there. We will not be met with resistance on the thing. But I thought that was really, really, really sweet. She decided to let me know.
So after the transformation, what happens to these? How many? The 18, did you say? How many?
16.
16.
Oh, they go back. Now, in Richmond's case, when they came down to Richmond, that involved politics. Governor Ralph Northam, just before he lost the election, and just before Youngkin came in, Northam said, okay, I need to get these objects out of the reach of the Republicans. So it's a two-step process. First, I have to bequeath them to the city of Richmond, right? But then the city of Richmond had a plan, it was twofold, to then give the Black History Museum of Virginia possession of them. So they became the stewards. They're the owners of them, the ones in Richmond. I bring them up because they're huge, and the Black History Museum of Virginia is, it's an historic house, right? So what to do with these things is completely, and they were just like, in some sense, these things are like an albatross, right? And so, in talking with them, they seemed to be joking, but kind of weren't, about like, this could be a one-way ticket for these objects, they don't have to come back here. If you've got any use for them in California, we're open to suggestion. So they kept laughing about that, but I was like, I think they might be serious, in that regard. So yeah, so people not knowing what to do with them. In some cases, you try to recontextualize them. You can't give them away. Places not knowing what to do. They don't have the political will. They had enough will to take them down, but any further discussion about what's to be done with them in a lot of cases is emotions are still raw.
Yeah. Well, one of the great things your show will do is pose that question of what the survival of these dismantled objects should be. It's a kind of contemporary archaeology of the remnants and how to treat it, because I'm guessing, part of the tagging is helpful because then you can see where they are, because I'm guessing there's also a logic that would recompose these, the people who wanted to.
I don't know, that's a logic, that's hellish wishful thinking.
Exactly. But because I can also imagine them becoming something like Nazi memorabilia, like there'd be a kind of
interesting
cultish relationship to these as both taboo objects, but as a kind of relics of things like
with the double equestrian.
Yeah.
Vandals broke in where they were being stored in Baltimore, and they stole the sword, Robert E. Lee's sword. They cut it off of the statue, and they cut off the flag and flagpole on the Sailor and Soldiers Monument. And for that, that's exactly the sentiments,
right.
In terms of a kind of memorabilia.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Well, it's more than memorabilia, right? This is a belief in wanting to keep those values active.
Yeah. Because it seems like, maybe this will be my last comment. It's more a comment than a question, and we can see if other people have anything to say. But the project invokes so many different types and constructions of history. Like, it's hard, not to look at this and see things like the 1871 column and Place Vendôme and the toppling of Lenin statues post-USSR, and to see a whole history of techniques of dismantling and forms of dismantling and objects that are dismantled that are also attempts to dismantle political structures.
Ideologies.
Exactly. And so to see that within that context obviously reads those moments of dismantling as historical reenactments in a way, but reenactments with obviously different politics and different ways of understanding them. But it's the image of the removal that we hang on to from those previous moments.
Yeah.
And so I'm just wondering what the potency of the image of removal is for these monuments, and how that shows up in the exhibition, as opposed to the potency of the relics themselves.
Objects themselves. Yeah, I mean, it's funny, in terms of working on the book, one of the things I find myself averse to is like that kind of monument porn, right? Yeah. The dismantling porn, right? These shots of this, it lends itself to that kind of, and it's spectacular and it is spectacle. But tons of footage, out there for that. So one of the things that's important, I mentioned Richmond, right, and the grassroots efforts taking these things down. It's important to have that voice in the exhibition. So as far as like one of the areas where there will be video, of protests in the activism surrounding their removal, and that the Team Henry, Devon Henry was the cat who got the bid to take down the statues and the bases in Richmond. There'll be plenty of footage of him going at it, but he's given a number of interviews. He had a beautiful interview with him in the New York Times,
Yeah, I saw it.
Yeah. And it was just interesting also, just in New Orleans, when they put the bid out to do the job, the contractor who initially said, okay, we'll do the job, was a local contractor. and very successful local contractor. And his Maserati was firebombed. And so in the catalog, we'll have a full bleed picture of his firebombed Maserati. I'm not kidding, that will be in the catalog. Just to remember, right, how this went down. So from then on, no local contractor would take the job, threats. They had to go outside the city, and then ultimately they had to go outside the state. So when you see the images of the removals in New Orleans, they're wearing full body armor, no identity revealed, and they're not from around. They had to outsource it. So, it was, talking to Devon about it, I was like, man, I don't know. How did you, it's one thing in New Orleans, what does it mean for a black man, Devon is black, to actually get this job and to do it? Like, what about your safety? And he's like, yep, there are layers of security that I got to deal with now, in a way. But he's from Virginia, and took it on. So.
Any questions out here? Adam.
Yeah. It's a super fascinating project, and on the dismantling, I can't believe that you can afford a Maserati by dismantling Confederate monuments. That's kind of crazy.
Oh, the money for the dismantling, people think it's the statues, millions to take the bases down.
Oh my God. Most of us would probably do it for free. But my question is about, I guess, and the question of dismantling is really fascinating, but about the construction of these monuments in the first place. And again, we can talk about what they signify, but they're also art objects, right? In some way, right? Like that some sculptor sculpted them.
Oh yeah.
And it was so bad, and I hadn't really considered that until you showed the photo of Duchy, the granite one. That was maybe, did you say it was the first Confederate monument to be toppled because the Confederate people hated it so much?
Yeah.
And again, in New York, we take for granted bronze men on horses pointing at things. But I'm wondering how a certain kind of style emerged, right? That comes to stand in for the Confederacy, right? The bronze man on the horse. And also how it gets really weird sometimes, with, I think you said, the gay Confederate general with the angel wings and the pomfron over himself. And if you could talk a little bit about the origin of these things and about the objects themselves as kind of art objects or aesthetic objects, or the aesthetics of the monumentalizing of racism or slavery.
Yeah, it's, in terms of their art historically, right? Them coming out of a funerary impulse, right? How do you mourn the war dead, right? And the charge being led by the UDC, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, right? So the Lost Cause was minted in 1866. So right immediately after the Civil War, that narrative got put into circulation, and then was taken up, by organizations such as the UDC and sister organizations, because of they lost, and how do you come to terms with that? And rather than it's a loss that you can't face, so you'd rather sing of them as heroes rather than to think of them as having died in vain, right? It's pretty much as simple as that in a way. But that narrative, right, then that would almost be in some sense, art historical or cultural in a sense, in terms of then also the development of iconography, the lionizing of Lee. How did he go from potentially being up on treason charges to then becoming, these things becoming civic virtue, right? So that happens within a 30-year window, let's say. But the Redeemers and Plessy versus Ferguson, the coming of Jim Crow, right? The way that, sociopolitically, the attempts at disenfranchising, right? Recently free slave population, and culturally, those two things basically merge by the early 20th century. So to take on, a significance far beyond simply mourning, right? Now, we're still just talking about statuary. We can go in any number of directions. It depends on which you can break it up into different categories and things like, the soldier at rest, the soldier at ready, a real kind of iconography, right? The backpack, the belt buckle, what tells you it's a Union versus what tells you it's a Confederate soldier. But I would fast forward to 1915 and D.W. Griffith and Birth of a Nation. That is the biggest of all and most successful of all Confederate monuments. So it isn't what the bronzes do. And like you're saying, it's like a man on a horse. They just become a kind of like furniture or something that just like drifts into the background of sorts, civically in a weird way, or a fixture, as opposed to the active narrative. D.W. Griffith's father served in the Confederacy. And so that did more to put the lost cause into popular imagination and currency. So then there are the statues after Birth of a Nation, for example, right? All that to say, it's basically, like a kind of convergence, both culturally and sociopolitically, of forces that then results in the Confederate monuments and what they stand for as we know them now, right? Now you've got to think of them also as playing out all the way up into the civil rights movement, right? They're still putting up statues to these things, which then take on an entirely new meaning, right, against that set of forces. So I don't know how far that goes in addressing the questions.
Thank you. I just had another question about the afterlife of the monuments. I know you've dwelt on it somewhat, but I wonder whether the question of what happens to these monuments after they are shown will enter into the exhibition at all. And we had the privilege of seeing the photo of all the destroyed granite fragments, but and you shared the bit about the tags, but there's almost something threateningly impermanent about those storage situations, and I wonder if you'll be addressing that at all, or whether there's another project where you engage with these sites more directly.
Right. That's not just the afterlife of the monuments, that's the afterlife of the monuments exhibition. in terms of public programs, and in a way to begin to address that question, one of the things about the exhibition is we wanted to serve as creating a greater kind of collective consciousness about these objects amongst the lenders even. So for one city to know what another city has done, right? So even though it is front of mind in some sense as an issue, it's actually hopelessly local and siloed when it comes to the on-the-ground conditions and what's at play politically in terms of how decisions get made. So to hopefully broaden people's horizons about, or at least at minimum, so these municipalities in terms of grappling with this don't feel like they're alone in trying to figure out perhaps what to do with these things. But yeah, some of the fragments of stone, just like what the Valentine Museum did in terms of wanting that as a piece of the city's history. At the Valentine Museum, they consider themselves like it's Richmond's historical museum, right? And they've beautifully already folded that into that narrative, right? Oh yeah, there's one thing I wanted to mention about with the mourning of them. for example, that I got fascinated with. The issue of the obelisk, right? In the wake of the war, that there wouldn't have been very much money in a decimated South to erect or commission a likeness of, you know, the war dead. But at the same time, given the status and the troops that were there, it was a total no-go. It's like, there's no way in terms of being able to put up a likeness of somebody that we're considering a traitor, that actually would have been a lot more palpable in that period. So the obelisk was a, you know, right, that's as far as we'll let you go. You get an obelisk and you can put the names around the base of it.
Thank you. This is a deliberately naive question that refers both to this particular exhibition and your own work. But why LA? It seems that you've touched on some of the things of like money, of security. You've also touched on the idea of your own career transition from the Renaissance Society and some of the international implications of legitimating this work as art when it's in LA. Similarly, you've also talked about the potential of doing an exorcism if it were truly in one of the southern capitals. But so I guess in the most open sense, why LA?
That's where I live. Yeah, I mean, I would have had the thought, the idea. I mean, waking up on that August morning and watching the stuff in Charlottesville, that's where the idea came from, right? So seeing the president get up and say, there are fine people on both sides. And it wasn't that, it was watching Orrin Hatch the next day, right? The idea of me and Orrin Hatch, and Orrin Hatch said exactly what was in my mind. I mean, to a T. And the idea that it was just like, Orrin Hatch, he said, watching that footage of Charlottesville, are those tiki torches? Which is my first thought when I saw the image. I was just like, I didn't know. I was like, oh wait, those are tiki torches. Is this real? Like, to a way of questioning, was this really, is this a piece of theater or are they really marching, right? But the tiki torches were what I got fixated on. Yeah. And of course, with the idea that Orrin Hatch saw the same thing and had the exact same question, I was just like, I can't believe this. This is, you know, kind of crazy. So that was the idea for the show. Independent, you know, I was in LA at the time, but then, you know, in terms of going and talking to the staff the next day about this crazy idea, then it just got more and more out of control because I was like, yeah, we need to do it. Yeah. And then if we did it, we would ask Kara to like co-curate, and the staff was just like, whoa, man, what? This is like, is this the crack you're doing in Chicago? Like, just pushing this? You know, it's like, yeah. And then we'll call Mocha and see if we can borrow the Geffen. The staff was just like, go for it. I was like, okay, you guys be my enablers. So that's, you know, why LA, the conditions. You know, right time, right place, you know, in some sense. But we're looking into possibly touring the show, and it'll have an afterlife, you know, of sorts. But the D.W. Griffith thing is important to me. That's one of the pillars of the exhibition. So we're commissioning Stan Douglas to do a piece that takes on Birth of a Nation, which was filmed, you know, in lots, you know, in Los Angeles. At least there's some kind of immediate time. But that's the question most people have, like, what kind of, you guys don't have any skin in this game. You got your own kind of monuments to deal with. What about like Christopher Columbus?
I'm curious about how the artists in the exhibition, particularly the commissioned artists, are dealing with like the physical bigness of these works, like the monuments, and also how you as the curator are dealing with scale. Because yeah, I mean, even in our conversation, like there's been like a real bigness to these pieces, and like how does the sort of artwork response or like that's being exhibited in opposition, like how does that, I'm just curious, like where that.
So I'm curious too. Sometimes you got to do the show to see. Yeah, and it's the ones that you feel like, it's like, I want to see this. I want to see this. I really want to see this. It could totally fail, but I got to see this. And that's like the show you do, you know, in a way. but the, you know, not too many of the artists are engaging like directly with the monuments, you know. And if they are, it's in terms of content rather than like physical proximity or having to incorporate it, you know. But it's, the statues are usually up on a pedestal in a park or on a median, and we deal with them as signs, like they stand for something, right? But we don't deal with them as objects, and there's no scale really. I mean, we have some sense of scale of them when they're outdoors, but outdoor scale is one thing. So one of the real tenets of the exhibition that's really, really important is that the monuments be decontextualized, meaning they cannot, so people are like, oh yeah, if you want to do this, you know, I've got a lot, you know, there's a guy who's a developer in downtown LA, he's like, I got a lot next to Staples Center. If you need some outdoor space, let me know. You know, I was like, no. It's important that these things, if they go up, that's too close to what, just having them up outdoors is too close to what they do, where they speak, right? But having them indoors and then not on the pedestals, when they're on your ground plane, they get bigger. They're suddenly huge because they're now in relationship to your body. So then you deal with them like in all of their gross materiality as objects. So they become they become things rather than signs really quick. And so I think that's something that is not being banked on. Like, you know, I think that's going to be one of the big factors in the show when people come and encounter it. But the Geffens, you know, I mean, it's indoors, but it can handle it.
Hi, I had I guess 2 quick points. It was interesting to hear you mention Birth of a Nation. I remember that film being used to sort of demonstrate film techniques in my own film classes. I mean, it was given some context, but I wonder today if that's still the case. And second, have you been tracing at all what has become of these deserted, empty spots, if there have been commissions for artists to replace them or added plaques, signage?
Yeah. As for Birth of a Nation, it is still, you know, it's canonical. I mean, if you know, at minimum for film technique, for the way narrative, that things people had never seen before, right? In terms of editing and how do you tell a story, right? And it was interesting. It was a great, Roger Ebert wrote an essay not too long before he passed, I believe, about Birth of a Nation, and he made a really great and incredible point about people were saying, well, they white actors in blackface, that they didn't use black actors for, and there are black actors actually in Birth of a Nation, you know, but in terms of like infill or back scenes, but they aren't, you know, agents in terms of action, you know, in the film. And it's so, and Roger Ebert mentioned it, like they're in blackface, and it's patently obvious that they aren't black. Like the makeup job is so bad, you know. And Roger Ebert, and this is a source of protest around the film part. And he was saying, no, it would have been far more if black actors had engaged with the white actors, by which he meant white women, in terms of scenes, that would have caused the riot. You know, not as like that the white audiences had to know that the black characters were in fact white and not black in order to feel comfortable. Like, how far, what were the degrees in the suspension of disbelief, right? We can go this far, but if you actually have black actors, it's like, nah, that's not happening, you know, in the film. But knowing that they are white would keep you at ease, right? And I thought that was a really interesting point, you know, that he made in terms of Birth of a Nation. In terms of the second part about the what was it? Yeah, it's there's been discussion, particularly in Richmond at one point, around, you know, reusing the plinths and the sites. But the Southern Poverty Law Center, they have a database that is the central database of all Confederate monuments, including holiday names, street names, building names, in addition to the statues. And I think it's called Whose Heritage is the name of the website, of the subset within the Southern Poverty Law Center's website. You just go to Whose Heritage, and it's a fabulous resource, and that's what we used. And their designation of a monument, in terms of whether it's active or not, the base has to be removed. And to use their words, the monument is still active. It has to be removed root and branch, and I really like that language, in order for it to be considered inactive and gone. So, in other words, if you take the statue and still have the base there, that's not enough. They still consider it, that's still active. Right? So I think of that as a very interesting, I kind of like that, you know, that they take a hard line. Somebody's got to, right, on it, just in terms of that, you know, where things stand. But right now, I mean, Baltimore, they're one of the, you know, from the Baltimore Museum of Art, that plinth for the double equestrian Lee, Stonewall Jackson, there are lots of performances that take place on that one. It's very big, very broad. Yeah.
Maybe one last question here. Yeah.
I was interested in knowing if you met any resistances or challenges putting this together, and if you anticipate any criticisms or backlashes, or I don't know, any protests even possibly.
Oh yeah,
the opening.
One of the biggest budget line items is security and the layers of security, and having to deal with, like, you know, this is not business as usual, right? So the negotiations, I thought getting the monuments was going to be really hard, you know, from the municipalities. That was what it was. Those negotiations and discussions. Just as hard, if not harder, was actually this negotiations with MoCA and its staff, right, which is ongoing, about, like, I don't feel safe. It's not like I'm out there explaining to a public as if there were a public so actively interested in the paintings of Robert Ryman, you know, and it's like, what do I do next to one of these things, right? So that has been far more intense a discussion than any of the discussion with any of the politicos and the city councils and stuff. So having to have, you know, they're just not equipped to deal. So having to have another layer of security and armed security is a big discussion. And so at the level of, like, criticism, love it, I don't care. You know, right? Because I would do, like, when you're dealing with, like, security issues of a certain magnitude, like, there are things about, like, threat levels and stuff. It's like, at that time, it's like, you know, love it, hate it, whatever you're gonna write. But that's true of any show that, you know, when we mount a show, period.
Well, we're going to finish off, but I want to, in finishing, come back to this really compelling description that you have of these monuments and their formal aesthetic history, that they're kind of empty forms to begin with because they're so generic. They're just a kind of formulaic lament sculpture based on kind of graveyard remembrances. But it's a form that gets injected with signification. So it's a kind of dumb form that gets signified again and again, but both in the Jim Crow era and the Griffith film, and then again in the civil rights movement. So it's this weird object that has no discernible formal aesthetic convention, except for its weird capacity to be continually re-signified and reinvested with all of the implications of that re-signification. But in your telling, it's in that shift from it being assigned to suddenly a kind of material object that you perform a kind of designification of it, all of the ways in which those objects have accumulated new forms of signifying potency in our encounter with them. The curatorial gambit is that this is going to be not just encounter with them, objects in their, what did you call them? Their weird, gross materiality.
Oh yeah, that's right.
But it's also going to be an encounter with them suddenly as newly designified objects in a way. And so that's one aesthetic future for them. The other one is the one that you pointed to, which is more like their administrative aesthetic future, which is that they're going to be tagged and spreadsheeted and bureaucratized. They're going to be more like Buclo administrative aesthetic objects, and they're going to, on one hand, they're going to be that, like a kind of encounter with their gross designifying materiality, and the other hand, it's a bit like the last scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark. They're just going to disappear into a kind of massive grid of administrative nothingness, so of all of the questions that the exhibition poses, I think it's that question of how to read history differently through these objects as they become designified, but also what we do with them now. And I know you don't have the full answer to that, but I think that the show posing that as a fundamental scene of encounter with these objects is one of the incredible things it's going to do.
Yeah.
And thank you so much, Hamza.
Yeah. Wait till you see Kara's piece. That's right. Thank you.